About 5 years ago, I co-founded an organization called Millennials that has since then grown to 10 different cities in Brazil. And what we do is essentially help young people and hundreds of thousands of young people who are members of our organization to participate more effectively in local politics and actually advocate for the policy changes and the community changes that they want to see in their own cities and their own communities. And when I was invited to speak here today, I looked at the guest list, and I realized that I was probably going to be one of the youngest speakers, if not the youngest speaker. I have to ask our amazing ballerina from yesterday how old she is. But it's probably between her and I. And, it was very easy for me to sort of fall into the temptation of just giving an entire talk about what young people are up to these days, which is exactly what I'm going to do. But I'm going to start by recognizing that when you think about my generation, when you think about millennials, you probably think of this, the me generation, right? Like the timeless Time magazine cover. You think of young people who are obsessed with selfies and selfie sticks and are, essentially spoiled brats. And you're not entirely wrong. There is some truth to that. But when I think of my generation and when I think about the young people that I encounter every day in my work, the young activists that I work with, this is what I think about. I think about young people that are taking to the streets and to social networks and sharing their dreams and hopes for the future, and that are fighting to make those dreams come true. I think of young activists that really want to change the way their communities operate. And I think it is my responsibility, because I talk to them every day, to really come here on stage today and defend my generation and tell you that I come from the best generation ever, and I can prove it with data. So, first of all, we are better educated than any other generation before us. We're better educated than our parents and grandparents. We are also more driven by access than ownership, which means that we just don't care as much as previous generations about, owning things, as far as we have access to the services that those things could provide. And we could be holding the keys to a post-consumerist, post-industrialist society in our own hands, and that's pretty exciting. We are also, and that's, I think, a very crucial point, more civically engaged than the general population. And the research on this understands civic engagement as two things. One is wanting or acting to change policy or affect policy in any way, and the other one is volunteering or actually contributing to a community. And we do that at higher rates than the general population. And of course, we are also feminists. There's a much higher proportion of young girls today that declare themselves as feminists than we had with Generation X. So we are taking that on and making feminism sexy and interesting again, and we're doing that every day. And of course, last but not least, our biggest legacy is making the best cat gifs and internet memes of all time. So, you're welcome for that. But this is all us, I promise you. You would not have the rebellious bird if it hadn't been for our generation. But in spite of all these amazing things, our generation also has one small problem. And we've talked about it in yesterday here at the conference, and the problem is we don't vote. Or at least we just don't vote to the same extent that our parents and grandparents voted. Voter turnout rates around the world, both for parliamentary and presidential elections, have been going down sharply. There are some exceptions, depending on how heated an election is, but the general trend looks exactly like this. In the last congressional elections, about 40% of voting age Americans voted. That's extremely low. It means that you guys are being governed by a Congress that was elected by, probably less than 30% of the general population. That is extremely, extremely worrisome, and it helps us understand a little bit more about the crisis in representation and how people are feeling about that Congress that, at the end of the day, they didn't actually choose. And what's really worrisome, and worries me the most, is that some leaders are recognizing this trend, and they know that we are angry, and they know that our anger at the system has led us to this point of just not voting, not caring anymore. And we know that they also know that it's just not our generation. They know that we're speaking for all of us when we say that this just isn't working anymore. It isn't working in the way that maybe has once worked or maybe never worked, and we're just recognizing it now. And these leaders are taking that anger and that they're taking that indifference to some extent, and they're trying to channel that to their own goals. And when I say that, of course, it's very easy to think of Donald Trump as someone who's doing that right now here in the US. I'm also thinking of leaders in my country like Michel Temer, or even left-wing politicians like Corbyn in England. I'm not talking about the policies that they're trying to advance. And of course, I recognize that there are many, many differences between a Trump and a Corbyn, and I don't mean to imply that they're the same in any way, but I do mean to say that all three of these men are doing one thing. They are trying to turn what is very clearly a crisis of representation, very well-justified anger at how the system is working, and a recognition that it is failing many of us, and they're trying to turn that into a crisis of representatives. They're essentially saying, it's not that the system is broken, it's just that I haven't been elected yet. And when I get there, I would just change everything because I'm an outsider, because I'm not a professional politician, because I'm not tied to all of these, or maybe because I'm not corrupt, maybe because, I am closer to the working people. They have many reasons to believe and to try to make us believe that they would be better than everyone else, but that's all they're doing. And that may work, and I think it will work to some extent for maybe 1 or 2 electoral cycles, and demagogues and fearmongers will be in power. But at some point, that's also going to grow old, and we are going to realize that it's not about who's sitting at the pinnacle of power, it's about how power itself is distributed in our society today, and how the system that we have put in place to actually elect people and choose our leaders is essentially filtering for the worst possible leaders we could ask for. We know that we are currently making a choice between maybe the lesser of two evils. That's how most young people feel about elections today. It's a no. Someone comes to you and says, you are going to die. Here's one way you're going to die. Here's another way you're going to die. And you get to choose because you're all-powerful, an engaged citizen. And that's just not good enough. And we're going to have to redesign it. And the problem is when we do get to redesign it, we just don't know what we're going to do. And I don't know either, so, in case you were wondering, I'm not here to give you that answer. I wish I had it. But I do know a few things about how we can go about redesigning it. The first thing that I know is that the new political system that we are going to put in place at some point, I hope, will have to be more collaboratively designed. I also know that it will be issue-specific. It will be more liquid than other democratic systems that we have seen in the past, and I know that it will be focused on the commons. And I will explain what I mean when I say all of these things. First, when I say collaboratively designed, all I mean to say is that we're not going to have a big constitutional moment like we had in the past, at least not in the same model, right? Like, we're not going to do this by elite consensus like we have always done. We're not just going to gather a bunch of old men in a room and listen to them sort of design a system that essentially allows them to rule us with some sort of peaceful alternance between them, and then tell us that, this was the will of the people. That's just not going to happen. The most interesting democratic experiments that we are seeing my generation sort of experimenting with are coming from the public squares, the public occupations, the collectives, the co-working spaces even, any place where people are choosing to work or live together and where they need to make decisions, and they are trying to make those decisions without having to delegate their voice every time. They're trying to make those decisions in a different way. So there's some elements there that can point us to the right direction. The other thing that I know is that our new democratic system will have to gear to a generation that is a lot more liquid and fluid in the way it engages itself in politics. Remember that I said that we have higher levels of civic engagement than the general population. We're also have higher levels of education. When you take those two things together, it's really surprising that we're not voting. Because, common sense will tell you, if someone is interested in policy and has access to information, why would they not vote? And I think part of the reason is that we are more interested in affecting a specific policy, a specific cause, than we are in just electing someone to make all of these decisions for us. And one recent example of that is Brexit. So, when Brexit happens, a bunch of newspapers were saying, millennials, again, millennials, they didn't vote, and now they're complaining, but really, like, we're disappointing at them because they didn't vote, and now they say that they're screwed for the rest of their lives, but, they could have come and just, made their voices be heard, but they chose not to do that. And it's true, over 70% of millennials were against Brexit. And the early data from polls had shown that only 32% of them had actually showed up to vote, which was worrisome. But then the LSE came a few weeks later and said, actually, that's all wrong. Voter turnout rates for millennials for Brexit were actually twice as high as we had initially thought. 64% of millennials voted, and that was the highest turnout rates for that age population in the last 25 years. So that was actually a remarkable turnout rate for millennials. It's still lower than that of our older counterparts, which is still a problem. But I do think it points us to a direction, which is we are more interested in making those kinds of decisions that impact our lives very, very quickly and very directly, and not necessarily just choosing a leader to make those decisions for us for 4 or 5 years. And the third thing that I think is really, really interesting has to do with our relationship with the public. Usually when we think about elections and politics, we think about public goods, public services, and how the state can provide those public goods and services to us. And that remains really important today, of course. But our generation is also looking at the commons as something that is almost more important to us than the public is. And when I say the commons, I don't mean air, water, sort of like classical economic theory commons. I mean what happens when we actually collaborate and cooperate, when we work together. I mean the things that we are only capable of having, of developing, of designing, of creating, if we do it together. Think of the public as the public square. And think of the commons as what happens when people actually go to that public square and play music, fill it with art, fill it with culture, do interesting things with that public infrastructure. That's what the commons is. And our generation is not just thinking about how to change the public, it is also thinking about how to create the commons every day. And I'll give you 2 examples of how that plays out from my own work. The first example is from a few months ago in Brazil. In April this year, a young girl, age 16, was gang raped in Rio, my hometown, by 33 men. And one of the men actually taped it and put it up on YouTube. And YouTube took it down, so don't worry, Google. But it was horrible, obviously, and it created a massive scandal. And then all of a sudden, women were taking to the streets and talking about rape culture in Brazil in pretty big numbers. And I was sitting with my team at my office, and we talk to these young women all the time. We are these young women. And we really wanted to know how we could help. And then my intern, who lives in one of Rio's favelas in Complexo da Maré, she said that she had been raped when she was a kid, and we knew that. That was something that we were working on with her, and we knew that she needed support on that. But she said that one of the most difficult things that she had to do was actually get mental health services, get access to mental health services. It was really, really hard to do that using the universal public health system in Brazil. We have a universal public health system. It works pretty well for some things. It works really badly for others. And mental health is one of the areas in which it's harder to get treatment. So she shared that with us, and we decided to develop a tool where therapists could just sign up. They had to give us 3 professional references and their diploma and a bunch of other information so we could actually verify their identity. But they would sign up and give away free hours of mental health treatment to victims of sexual violence. And we just put it up online, and we said, let's just see what happens. Let's not make a big deal out of it, because we don't know, how capable of doing that filtering we will be. So let's just do it very discreetly and see what happens. And a week later, we had 500 therapists that had already signed up through word of mouth through the system, and those were the therapists that we actually filtered, right? Those are therapists that had the professional references, that had the real diplomas. And we also had a way for volunteers to sign up, so they could actually go to the public health services available in their city, the very few that do exist, and rate them. And after that, we just released the new version of this tool to victims of sexual violence so they could come in and leave their email addresses, and we emailed them a list of therapists in their city or in their neighborhood that could see them for free, and also a list of the publicly available health services. It was a small thing. It did not change rape culture in Brazil. That requires a much bigger scale intervention. But I think it's interesting because it shows exactly what I was talking about. This is not just about making demands on our state We will do that, and we are doing that every day. But it's also about recognizing that the state is already failing. And meanwhile, we have real girls suffering from a very real kind of violence that need real help. And we are able to help them if we pull our resources together. The second example is from a public school in Rio. That public school was going to be demolished right before the World Cup to build a parking lot for the Maracanã Stadium. And one of the students, who at the time was just 10 years old, started a campaign with us. Her name was Bia. And the campaign was essentially, please help me, I don't want my school to be demolished. Very, very simple ask. And because the school was empty, it was summertime, we developed a tool to actually watch the school through a webcam 24/7. And people could come in and leave their cell phone numbers, and if anyone saw a bulldozer coming to destroy the school, they would just press a button, and an SMS message would be fired to everyone who had left their cell phone number so they could physically come to the school. That happened a few times, and the governor started getting a really, really bad press. And he was super upset and called us irresponsible and said that the parking lot was really needed. But after many months of fighting, he actually gave up on destroying the school, and it remained in place. And the interesting thing that actually just happened just a couple weeks ago is that just a couple weeks ago, that school was chosen the best public school in the state of Rio by the Brazilian Public Education Index, IDEB. And that was just now. That school was already pretty good. It wasn't like a failing school. We knew it was a good quality school, but it has risen to the very top, mostly because of school community involvement. The teachers and students and parents that fought so hard to keep that public infrastructure in place, then saw it as theirs, and therefore they wanted to be involved, and they were involved many, many times. So that's another example of how that works in real life. All of these examples point us not to sort of a new totalitarian system, not to the big answer, but to small experiments that are showing us that our generation is capable of developing new ways to organize and to impact our communities. And when the time comes, I am confident that we are going to have the answers to how to fix our system. But we're not going to do that from the top down. We are going to have to do that from the bottom up. And we will experiment and continue to do that every day. So, for all of you who may have maybe kids or grandkids or peers around my age and may be worried about how this is all going to come about, one thing that I will tell you, quoting from a fellow Latin American, a Chilean student who took to the streets to protest their educational system, is that, Mom, don't worry, we will win. Thank you.